Every summer, between June and September, families across the United States braced for what doctors in the 1800s called the dying season. Infant mortality spiked. Adults doubled over with stomach cramps after Sunday dinners. Entire neighborhoods fell sick from the same batch of milk or the same cut of beef from the same butcher on the same street corner. Then, in 1927, General Electric released a clunky white appliance with a motor bolted to the top. It cost about $300, roughly $5,400 in today's money. It hummed loudly enough to rattle the dishes, and quietly, it ended one of the longest-running public health crises in American history. This is the story of the refrigerator, and it begins long before anyone had one. How does a country feed itself when nothing stays cold? That was the question every American household had to answer every single day for most of this country's history. The answer was salt, lots of it. In colonial America and well into the 1800s, preserving food meant fighting a constant battle against decay. Salt was the primary weapon. Families packed pork and beef into barrels of brine, layering so much sodium chloride into the meat that it could survive for months without spoiling. The taste was brutal. Imagine biting into a piece of beef that had been sitting in what was essentially concentrated seawater for half a year. Before cooking it, you'd soak it overnight just to make it edible. Even then, it tasted more like salt than meat. Smoking was the other common method. Most farms in 18th century America had a smokehouse, a small wooden building where strips of pork, fish, and venison hung above slow-burning embers for weeks at a time. The smoke coated the meat with natural compounds that slowed bacterial growth. It worked reasonably well, but it also meant your main source of protein for much of the year tasted like a campfire. For dairy products and eggs, families relied on spring houses. These were small stone buildings constructed directly over natural springs, where crocks of butter, milk, and eggs sat in constantly flowing cold water to stay cool. If you didn't live near a spring, you used a root cellar, an underground room where the surrounding earth kept temperatures close to 40 degrees throughout the year. Root cellars were excellent for storing potatoes, carrots, turnips, and apples. For fresh meat and milk in August, they were almost useless. And that was the real problem. The methods that worked during winter simply fell apart in summer. As temperatures climbed, bacteria multiplied at alarming speed. Yet, no one understood why. The only diagnostic tool people had was their nose. If food smelled fine, you ate it. If it smelled bad, you cut away the spoiled portion and ate the rest. There were no thermometers, no expiration dates, no understanding of bacteria. People simply hoped for the best. Then the story took a turn that nobody in 1805 could have predicted. That year, a 22-year-old from a wealthy Boston family named Frederic Tudor wrote something remarkable in his diary. He and his brother William planned to cut the natural ice that formed on their family's pond in Saugus, Massachusetts, slice it into massive blocks, load it onto a ship, and sell it to people in the Caribbean, people who had never experienced anything truly cold. Everyone thought they were insane, shipping frozen water across the ocean to a tropical island and expecting customers to pay for it sounded like a joke. In 1806, Tudor loaded 130 tons of ice onto a ship called the Favorite at the docks in Charlestown and sailed for Martinique. The Boston Gazette reported the news with barely concealed amusement. "No joke," the paper wrote. "A vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation." At first, it did. The people of Martinique had no interest in buying frozen water. Tudor's brother had failed to find customers or even a suitable building to store the ice. The entire venture collapsed. Frederic Tudor returned to Boston humiliated and deeply in debt. He tried again. He failed again. Then he tried again. At one point, he was sent to debtor's prison. When he got out, he tried again. In his journal, he wrote a line that would define his career: "Let those laugh who win." Eventually, after years of experimenting with insulating ice using sawdust and constructing proper ice houses in tropical ports, Tudor finally succeeded. By 1820, he was regularly shipping ice throughout the West Indies and the American South. By 1833, he had expanded his trade all the way to Calcutta, India. Tudor also understood something profound about human behavior. In port cities, he gave away free ice to bartenders. Once people experienced a cold drink, he believed, they would never willingly return to a warm one. He was right. Demand exploded. Ice houses soon appeared in Havana, Jamaica, New Orleans, Charleston, Calcutta, Bombay, and Singapore. Within just a few decades, ice had become the second most transported commodity on American ships, surpassed only by cotton. By 1855, 12 different companies were shipping ice from the Boston area, all competing in the market Frederic Tudor had created almost single-handedly. He became known as the Ice King. When Tudor died in 1864 at the age of 80, the industry he had built was worth millions. At the time, his decision seemed surprisingly small. In reality, it changed everything. Frederic Tudor hadn't just created a business, he had created a dependency. Americans had experienced cold food and cold drinks. They were never going back. By the 1860s, the Icebox had become a fixture in middle-class American kitchens. These were insulated wooden cabinets, usually lined with tin or zinc, with a compartment at the top that held a large block of ice. Beneath it sat a drip pan that collected the meltwater, a pan someone in the household had to empty every single day unless they wanted a puddle spreading across the kitchen floor. Families developed routines around the daily delivery of ice. Women placed cards outside their homes telling the iceman how much ice to bring. Some houses even featured a small access door behind the icebox, allowing the iceman to slide a fresh block inside without tracking mud through the house. By the time the Civil War began, roughly 2/3 of households in Boston and New York received daily ice deliveries. For the most part, the system worked, but it had serious limitations. Iceboxes kept food cool, not cold. They slowed spoilage, but they couldn't stop it. A single block of ice lasted about a week under ideal conditions, and even less if the door was opened frequently. Worse still, the ice was only as clean as the pond it came from. In rapidly growing cities with polluted waterways, contaminated ice carried its own dangers straight into the kitchen. The entire system also depended on one unpredictable resource: winter. A warm season could trigger an ice famine, leaving entire cities without enough natural ice to preserve food. During the ice shortages of the early 1900s, New York City's poorest families suffered the most, with no affordable way to keep milk or meat safe during the summer heat. And the heat was the real enemy. Throughout the 19th century, America's food supply was, by modern standards, a quiet catastrophe. Summer was always the worst. Bacteria flourished in warm temperatures, and without a reliable cold chain, food traveled from farm to market to table in a constant state of decay. Meat often reached butcher shops already beginning to spoil. Milk spent hours traveling from rural dairies to city markets in unrefrigerated wagons, baking in the summer sun before anyone poured a single glass. The methods people used to extend shelf life were often more dangerous than spoilage itself. In the 1850s, New York City experienced one of the worst food safety disasters in American history. Its victims were babies. An estimated 8,000 infants died every year from severe, uncontrollable diarrhea. Yet for years, no one understood the cause. Doctors blamed mysterious diseases. Parents buried their children. The public moved on. Then, in 1858, journalist Frank Leslie published a series of investigations in his illustrated newspaper that exposed the horrifying truth. The killer was milk. More specifically, swill milk. This so-called milk came from cows confined beside whiskey distilleries in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Instead of proper feed, the animals were forced to eat the leftover grain mash from the distilling process because it was cheaper. The result was a thin, bluish liquid that barely resembled milk. To make it appear fresh, producers whitened it with plaster of Paris, thickened it with starch and rotten eggs, and tinted it with molasses. The finished product looked convincing enough to fool mothers buying food for their infants. It was also poisoning thousands of children every year in New York City alone. But the milk scandal was only one piece of a much larger problem. Across the United States, food adulteration had become routine. Pepper was mixed with coconut shells and floor sweepings. Coffee was stretched with ground acorns. Manufacturers relied on chemical preservatives that few people would willingly consume. Borax, salicylic acid, copper sulfate, and perhaps most disturbing of all, formaldehyde, the same chemical used to embalm dead bodies, was routinely added to meat and milk to slow decomposition. Then, in 1898, the crisis erupted into a national scandal. During the Spanish-American War, the United States Army purchased hundreds of tons of beef from Chicago meatpacking giants Armour, Swift, and Morris to feed American soldiers fighting in Cuba. The meat arrived rotten. It had been chemically treated. In some cases, it was outright toxic. Soldiers described the smell as resembling a dead human body preserved with formaldehyde. General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the United States Army, personally sampled the meat. His verdict gave the scandal its lasting name. He called it embalmed beef. The contaminated meat contributed to widespread dysentery and food poisoning, striking soldiers who were already weakened by malaria and yellow fever. During the war, disease killed twice as many American soldiers as Spanish bullets. A significant portion of those illnesses stemmed from the food the army was feeding its own troops. Public confidence in the nation's food supply was collapsing. Into that crisis stepped Harvey Washington Wiley, a chemist from Indiana who became chief of the Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Chemistry in 1883. For nearly 20 years, Wiley documented how food manufacturers were endangering the American public. He published reports. He delivered speeches. Congress showed little interest. Powerful food companies spent enormous sums lobbying lawmakers to keep federal regulators away from their businesses. So Wiley decided to prove his case in a way no one could ignore. In 1902, he recruited 12 healthy young men, most of them underpaid government clerks in their 20s, and offered them an unusual bargain. They would receive 3 home-cooked meals every day, 7 days a week, for at least 6 months. They would receive regular medical examinations. They would even earn $5 a month in spending money. There was only one condition. Harvey Wiley would slowly poison them. His staff mixed borax into their butter, milk, and coffee. Formaldehyde was added to meat. Copper sulfate found its way into fruit pies. The volunteers knew exactly what they had agreed to. A sign hanging outside the dining room captured the spirit of the experiment. None but the brave can eat the fare. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. They nicknamed the volunteers the Poison Squad, and the experiments became a nationwide sensation. The Christmas dinner served in 1902 became famous. Applesauce, borax. Soup, borax. Turkey, borax. Canned string beans. Sweet potatoes, borax. Rice pudding, borax. Milk, bread and butter. Tea, coffee, and just a little more borax. The results were alarming. The borax trials revealed clear digestive damage. When Wiley began testing sodium sulfite, the volunteers became so sick that he was forced to end the experiment early. Only 3 of the original 12 men completed the sodium benzoate trial. Formaldehyde exposure was linked to damage affecting the brain, liver, and kidneys. The Poison Squad experiments continued for 4 years, and relentless newspaper coverage transformed public opinion. More than 1 million women wrote letters to the White House demanding a federal food safety law. The food industry fought back fiercely, funding friendly scientists and influential senators in an effort to stop reform. For a time, it looked as though the lobbyists might prevail. But events were already moving toward a turning point that would permanently change the American food system. In 1906, two events occurred almost simultaneously, finally breaking the political deadlock. First, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, exposing the horrific conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking plants. Then, Harvey Wiley's Poison Squad findings became impossible for the public and Congress to ignore. That same year, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. For the first time in American history, it became illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport adulterated or mislabeled food across the United States. The law laid the foundation for what would eventually become the Food and Drug Administration. It was a historic breakthrough, but it solved only half the problem. Regulations could prevent companies from adding formaldehyde to milk. They could not stop bacteria from multiplying in beef sitting on a hot July afternoon. For that, America needed something else. It needed cold. Reliable, consistent, mechanical cold. The science behind refrigeration had actually existed for decades. Back in 1834, an American inventor named Jacob Perkins built the world's first working vapor compression refrigeration system in London using ether as the refrigerant. The machine worked, but it was bulky, expensive, and never found a commercial market. The real breakthrough came in 1876, when German engineer Carl von Linde, working at the Technical University of Munich, developed a practical refrigeration system that used ammonia. Linde wasn't trying to solve food safety. His goal was to help German breweries control the temperature of beer during fermentation. But the technology he created proved useful for far more than brewing lager. By the late 1800s, commercial refrigeration was spreading through breweries and meatpacking plants across the United States. Refrigerated railroad cars transformed food distribution. For the first time, fresh beef from Chicago could arrive in New York still cold. Yet home refrigeration remained out of reach. Early refrigerators were enormous, expensive, and genuinely dangerous. The refrigerant gases they used were toxic, meaning a leak inside your home could be fatal. Even Albert Einstein became involved, helping design a safer refrigerator during the 1920s. Although his design was eventually made obsolete by the development of safer refrigerants, it reflected how serious the problem had become. The turning point for ordinary American households arrived in 1927, when General Electric introduced the Monitor Top refrigerator. Named after the gun turret of the Civil War ironclad USS Monitor, it was the first widely successful model to combine the compressor and refrigerated cabinet into a single freestanding unit. It wasn't perfect. It was noisy. It generated heat. The exposed compressor sitting on top warmed the kitchen while the refrigerator cooled the food. And it cost about $300, a small fortune in the late 1920s. None of that mattered. It sold more than 1 million units. By the early 1930s, about 8% of American households owned a mechanical refrigerator. That may sound modest today, but the growth was extraordinary. As New Deal programs and rural electrification expanded access to electricity, and as the introduction of Freon made refrigerators safer and more efficient, adoption accelerated rapidly. By the end of the 1930s, 44% of American homes had a refrigerator, even in the middle of the Great Depression. The refrigerator quickly became more than an appliance. It became a symbol of middle-class life. It represented cleanliness, modernity, good household management. Advertisements sold more than cold storage. They sold an identity. After World War II, refrigerator ownership surged even faster. By 1955, 80% of American households owned one. The effects reached into nearly every part of daily life. Neighborhood grocery stores, where families had once shopped several times a week because food spoiled quickly, gave way to supermarkets, where a single weekly trip could keep a household stocked for days. The Iceman disappeared. So did the milkman. Frozen food evolved from a novelty into a staple. In 1953, Swanson introduced the TV dinner, forever changing the American relationship with meals. Yet the most important transformation wasn't convenience, it was survival. Summer stopped being the dying season. Infant mortality linked to contaminated food plummeted. Food poisoning did not disappear, and it still hasn't. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, roughly 48 million Americans become sick from contaminated food every year, and about 3,000 die. But compared with the 1800s, when an unrefrigerated summer could devastate entire neighborhoods, those numbers represent a world that has been fundamentally transformed. And that transformation came from a simple box in the corner of your kitchen. It hums so quietly that most people forget it's even there. It doesn't look like a miracle, it looks like furniture. Yet for most of human history, keeping food cold was either impossible or depended on a fragile system of frozen ponds, sawdust insulation, horse-drawn wagons, and daily deliveries that could fail at any moment. The refrigerator's story isn't unique. It follows a pattern repeated throughout the history of modern innovation. Someone recognizes a problem that everyone else accepts as normal. A handful of determined, sometimes seemingly irrational people spend years, even decades, trying to solve it while the rest of the world laughs, doubts them, or simply ignores them. Eventually, a crisis forces change. At first, progress is slow. Then, almost overnight, the solution becomes so ordinary that future generations struggle to imagine life without it. The next time you open your refrigerator in the middle of the night for a glass of cold milk, remember this. Just a century and a half ago, that simple act would have been impossible for almost everyone on Earth. For thousands of infants in New York City, the absence of what now sits quietly in your kitchen was a death sentence. Humanity built a machine that makes cold air, and in doing so, it saved more lives than most people will ever realize.